The Trump administration is touting a 28-point peace plan to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. But what is the state of the war right now? What are the Ukrainians willing to compromise on? What does Russia actually want? What's in this plan, and does it have a chance of succeeding? Tamar Jacoby is the director of the New Ukraine project at PPI. She has been living in Kiev for the last several years. She's a journalist who's been documenting what's happening on the ground over in Ukraine, and she joins the podcast to discuss the war in Ukraine, the proposed peace deals, and why she thinks that Russia cannot be trusted to keep to this deal, or really any deal, until their ability to wage war has been depleted. As always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We appreciate all the likes, subscribes, every time you tell a friend, all of that, greatly appreciated. But if you really want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Get access to bonus episodes of the podcast, get access to our Sticker of the Month Club, join a local chapter, get involved, and become a member. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me in this episode is Tamar Jacoby. Tamar, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jeremiah. Thank you.
So I know you're joining us from Ukraine, and we appreciate you being here. And it's been a while, I think, since we've covered the war in Ukraine. And to be honest, I feel bad about it. There's been a lot going on in American politics that we've had to talk about. There's a lot going on around the world. But I think that, like a lot of people in America, my picture of the war in Ukraine is that I just don't get a lot of daily news about it. Unless I seek out news about what's going on in Ukraine, it doesn't dominate headlines the way it did in 2022 and 2023. You know, we entered 2024, we started worrying about the election. 2025 has been dominated by the dozens of rolling disasters brought by the Trump administration. And so I think, like a lot of people, I'm just kind of starved for context. I don't hear a lot about it. So I assume, well, I guess, not that much is happening. I have no idea if that assumption is correct or not. But I guess my first question for you, before we get into kind of the peace deals that are being proposed, what is the state of the war right now in Ukraine? How is Ukraine holding up? What sort of territory has been gained or lost? What is the state of how things are going right now?
Yeah, so a lot of people in America think that the war is there are two misconceptions. A lot of people in America think that the war is just the same. 4 years later, it's the same. And other people, even a worse misconception, think that Ukraine is losing. So the war does continue on the Eastern Front in Ukraine. It's about 500 miles from Kyiv, way to the east. And that situation is pretty stalemated. I mean, Russia has gained maybe a little over 1,000 square miles in the past year. Like, that's nothing. Like, that's, if along 1,000-mile front, that's like a few yards. There's a few places where they've made little inroads, but there's not really much change on the Eastern Front. So that war has been more or less the same line on the map for a couple of years now. It's hard fought over there. I mean, many days Russia loses 1,000 men a day. 1,000 men a day. Imagine that. Over the summer, there was a Russian offensive. They lost as many people as live in Salt Lake City, deaths and casualties. So huge Russian losses. They throw men at the front line, and Ukraine repels them.
Yeah, I've seen like different estimates. Obviously, it varies who you want to listen to: the Ukrainian government, the Russian government, various neutral services. But I've seen estimates that Russia this year has lost several 100,000 men, and that's both killed and injured, taken out of action, missing in action. that somewhere on the level of 2 to 300,000 or something like that.
The Institute for the Study of War is a very reliable source, and The Economist is a very reliable source. They say as of this summer, Russia had lost, again, deaths and casualties, about 1 million men total over the war.
And that's total since 2022.
That's total since 2022, and we're beyond that now.
I've seen something that was just in 2025. It was like 2 to 300.
Yeah. No, in 2025 is your estimate, right? And the point is, Russia's Ukrainians call them meat assaults. Russians just throw men at the front line. Ukrainians are much more judicious. They try to use they're playing defense, which is less dangerous or less toxic. I mean, it's still dangerous, but less deadly. They're increasingly using drones for not just attacking, but things like logistics. And so the ratio is about 3 or 4 to 1, right? So if Russia has total loss, killed and injured 1 million, Ukraine is something like a quarter of that. The Ukrainian casualties are a little harder to come by, oddly, but so a lot of death, a lot of suffering, but not much movement on the front. Russia's making some little gains now, but they're not significant. The town that everyone's talking about, Pokrovsk, I was there about a year ago, I guess. It was a nice little small town, near the front. Children were playing in the street. Russia's been trying to take it through that year. Now it's basically nothing but rubble. But, so Russia might take it in the next few weeks. It won't make that much difference. People say it's strategic. People say it's a hub. If Russia could just move beyond it and go further, they would. It's just a pile of rubble now. They'll have that pile of rubble, and that'll be that. It won't be a major breakthrough. So that's what's happening on the front. What people don't understand but the two things that have changed the thing that has changed significantly is that the war has really spilled over into Europe, right? So there have been dozens of drone overflights, fighter jet overflights, CEO assassination attempts, railroad lines blown up, a shopping mall in the middle of Warsaw was set on fire. And this is all Russia's way of saying, Europe, stop supporting Ukraine. And our goal is not just to take Ukraine. Our goal is to break up NATO, basically, and stop NATO's dynamism and stop NATO from expanding. And that's already happening in Europe on a major scale. That's the biggest change in recent years. So that, Ukraine is holding the line. The war is spilling over into Europe. Obviously, the US under Trump has stopped sending weaponry. They still sell weaponry to Europe to give to Ukraine, and there's been some of that. It's important because the US does make a few things that Europe can't make. Europe by now spends much more on the war than America, and it buys directly. Like Europe calls up Raytheon and says, we'd like a bunch of those interceptors, and Raytheon sends them for money, and then Europe gives them to Ukraine, and that's an important change. The US is not helping. The US is still at least doing that much, which gives Trump some leverage. And the other thing that the US is still doing is providing intelligence for Ukraine, which is very important for the war. Ukraine couldn't target a lot of its weaponry without American intelligence. So America is still helping the parts that are sort of free and, easy to do, or that the US makes money on. But so the front line's pretty static. The war is spilling over into Europe. US isn't helping. And the big questions now really are, can the Europeans step up what they're doing? Because Ukraine is running out of money. We're coming into a new fiscal year, and Ukraine does not, without Western support, does not have the money, even to pay teachers and, city workers, and so, let alone buy weapons. And so that's a big question. Will Europe step up to continue to buy American weaponry and to continue to provide money and other kinds of weaponry for Ukraine? And I guess the other big change that is really important is that the Ukrainian defense industry has just, exploded in a good way. I mean, it's not a good metaphor in this part of the world, exploded, but has grown enormously from almost nothing at the beginning to one of the biggest defense manufacturing bases in Europe. And they not only make drones, which everyone now knows about, and drone warfare has transformed war as we know it, but they make long-range missiles and howitzers and armored vehicles and all kinds of things. They supply. They're on track to, by the end of this year, a couple of weeks from now, supply half of what they need on the battlefield. And they could be actually doing a lot more, but again, they need Western investment. And so that's another big question. Again, will Europe in particular step up with more investment in the Ukrainian defense industry, which would be good for Ukraine, which is defending Europe, and it would be good ultimately for Europe, because they would then gain capacities to have a strong neighbor
Yeah.
with a good defense base. So that's kind of the sit rep, if you will.
It seems like with such a frozen conflict that, like you said, that to vastly oversimplify, but for several years the situation is roughly the same. That there's a stalemate in eastern Ukraine, and Russia does not have full control over the oblasts that it wants to fully control, and Ukraine has also not been able to seize meaningful territory back in some of those oblasts. But it seems like with that kind of frozen conflict, it really comes down to a question of will and perseverance to some extent. That whichever country is just willing to suffer longer is going to be the country that ultimately prevails here. My question here, and you can tell me if the question is just the wrong frame entirely, but to what extent is Ukraine able to keep this up? Because I hear concerns that, as someone who's not an expert, that Ukraine is running out of money, they're running out of weaponry, they're running out of men. They simply are having a hard time staffing the army at this point. But I also hear concerns that Russia is having to bring in North Korean soldiers, and that the war is less and less popular in Russia, and who knows how much popular sentiment even matters in Russia, given that Putin's really tight control over everything. But what is your sense of, like, both parties' commitment to the war? I guess that is either party actively looking for a way out, or are they both still pretty much, we are in this to the death?
Yeah, let's come back to that, but I want to question your description of a stalemated conflict, because I don't think it is a stalemated conflict for the reasons I said. Yes, the land border is pretty static, but Ukraine has made huge advances on the Black Sea. Ukraine has made important advances taking out 10% of Russian oil refinery capacity. Russia's made some advances in taking out Ukrainian energy, but stalemated doesn't, and the nature of the war, if you went to the front 2-3 years ago and you went to the front now, doesn't look anything the same or feel anything the same because of the changes in weaponry. So stalemated is kind of a reductive view of it. And the other important thing to understand, and then there's Europe. If you're sitting in Warsaw and the shopping center next door is in flames, that doesn't feel stalemated either, right? So I think stalemated is kind of looking at one little piece and saying stalemated. I would say the war itself is still very dynamic. And the other thing is that, and I'm coming to your question about will, but let's think about what the both sides are really fighting for. They're not really fighting over another couple of yards in Donetsk. That's important. But what Russia is fighting for is to take over Ukraine, to basically neutralize it or eliminate it as a country. And Ukraine is fighting to survive. And so, what happens in that little yard of territory in Pokrovsk, or 10 yards or 100 yards, is really not the issue. The issue is that after 4 years, Ukraine is still existing. And Ukrainians feel more Ukrainian than ever, and more, that surveys show, and more sure that Russia is bad, and less inclined to want to be part of Russia, which is what Putin wants. But that's why it's so hard to solve, right? Because what they want isn't just something you can divvy up with a ruler or a yardstick. What they're fighting over is, does this country exist or not? And Ukraine is still alive. So, from their point of view, that Ukraine still stands is you can call it stalemated, but I think they would call it, victory.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I picture this war, it's just like, it seems to me unlikely, from my limited knowledge, that there's going to be some sort of decisive tactical strike on
Right.
either side. That
That's right.
Ukraine gets some crazy new weaponry. Even in the best scenario, they get new weaponry, and they all of a sudden lightning strike, and they take back 80% of the territory. Like that seems far
Yeah,
fetched.
well, that's not gonna happen.
But it also seems far fetched that Russia is going to all of a sudden start making huge progress, and
Yeah.
Kiev is going to be threatened.
No, that's right.
It stalemated in that sense. And you're right that the war has been very dynamic. It's
Yeah, it is, but I think it's a dangerous
yeah.
concept because I think Trump has persuaded people to think the Ukraine doesn't have any cards, and it's just about who's gonna be the last man standing. And I think that's only part of the story, right? So I agree with you that there isn't gonna be a big territorial breakthrough by either side, right? And I agree with you fundamentally that the question is who's got the will to fight on longer. And I mean, for Ukrainians, it's do you exist? Which is, you can take a lot of suffering before you stop struggling for that. It's easy for us to look on. My metaphor is a man watching is a crowd watching a man in a river who looks like he's drowning. And the people standing on the side are going to say, well, he's not doing very well. This doesn't look good. It's probably all over soon. But if you're that man in the river, you're going to keep swimming as long as you can. Right?
I use the word sometimes genocide, which is a very charged word in the last couple of years for reasons unrelated to Ukraine. But I think about it in terms of Russia really wants, and Putin has been very explicit about this, that he does not think the idea of a Ukrainian is a legitimate idea to begin
Exactly.
with. He thinks that
Exactly.
they are essentially Russians with accents, and so that is
Less educated Russians with accents, he thinks.
a form of a genocidal idea, right? Like that is trying to erase a whole people.
Yeah, I don't like the term. I don't like the term. I don't like the
Yeah.
term. As an American Jew with, relatives who perished in the Holocaust, I don't think that's happening here. And so I'm squeazy with that term. But it's certainly true that Putin wrote in 2021 before he invaded. They shouldn't exist as a country. We want to absorb them back into Russia. And it's not just Ukraine. He wants to absorb everything that was once the Russian Empire and the Soviet sphere of domination back into Russia. That's why Europe is threatened. Because after
Hmm.
Ukraine, he wants Poland, and he wants Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, and he wants Romania. He wants all those countries back in the Russian embrace. And that's why it's just a bigger issue, and that a couple of yards in Donetsk is not the point. But on the will question, so I don't, Ukrainians are definitely tired of this war. Everybody knows somebody who's, fighting, and a lot of people know people who are dead or injured. I think everybody probably knows somebody dead or injured. And it's dark here in Kyiv now. It's there's electricity. My apartment, for a while, it was 8 hours a day. There was no electricity. 8 hours of the day, the hours you were up, which is quite a lot of them. Now it's down to kind of 6, but it's dark here. I go out on the street and I have everybody has, or I have, at least in my apartment, middle class people have something to keep the lights on or the internet going, but a lot of people don't, and the whole city goes black, and it's hard. People are tired, but they're not giving up. Nobody wants to give up. Now, Putin doesn't want to give up either. And so the question is, I think that Ukraine is willing to compromise on some things to get a peace deal, but not everything. And Putin's not willing to compromise on anything, at least so far. If that's what has to change. Putin's happy when the peace plan gives him everything he wants. And then when we'll talk about the peace plans in a minute, but when the peace plan gets modified, so he's not getting everything he wants, he says, "Oh no, sorry."
Well, let's talk about those, because this has come into the news again recently. Donald Trump likes to think of himself as a deal maker. He has an obsession with being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So to him, it almost seems like he just wants the conflict to stop and his name to be on it so that he can get the love and adulation of the world, or whatever. But the details obviously matter here. And there was a peace plan proposed by the Americans, and there was some interesting kind of stuff in there. That it was called a 28-point peace plan. What can you tell us about how that came about? What people should know about it? What's in that peace plan?
So what's in that peace plan was basically, I wouldn't call it an American peace plan. I would call it a Russian peace plan.
This is part of the controversy,
This
right?
is the controversy. So the guy who for years, Biden's Treasury identified him as the guy who managed Putin's basically slush fund. He's Putin's money manager, and it's not Putin's money, right? It's state money that's been siphoned off. That guy is a very suave, Western able diplomat, and he and Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, have struck up a friendship. And basically, that guy dictated 28 points to Witkoff to present to Trump as a possible blueprint for a plan. And how clear it is that Russia dictated it is revealed in one of the points. I mean, Putin basically gets everything he wants, or most of what he wants. Ukraine gets almost nothing. But there's a point in there that says Ukraine will be, all the Nazi activity and ideology in Ukraine will be eliminated. Well, there is no Nazi activity or ideology in Ukraine except in Putin's imagination. So the idea that that would become part of the peace plan, it's just something that the Russians wrote in because that's what Putin thinks. And it just tells you how clearly the whole plan was dictated by Russia. And of course, as the news has revealed, great reporting by Axios, it was Witkoff and another Russian diplomat who talked about, let's come up with a plan that favors Russia that I'll present to Trump, and we'll see if we can get any movement out of it. So Witkoff is actively working with Moscow to craft a plan that heavily favors Moscow. And he plunked that on the table as the 28-point plan last week. And the Europeans and Ukrainians said, and lots of Republicans in Congress, including Mitch McConnell and a lot of others, said this is outrageous. This isn't a fair plan. It's one thing for the U.S. to try to broker peace, but to adopt the Russian line, hook, line, and sinker, and put it in front of the world and say they're going to pressure Ukraine to do it, that's not legit. And so the U.S. has now backed off that plan.
There was some linguistic analysis, I believe, even where sometimes this happens. I'm used to seeing this on social media, where like somebody who says they're from Texas and says we should end the war in Ukraine, and they all of a sudden they'll let some phrase drop like warm water ports. Like anyone in Texas has ever thought about the phrase warm water ports before, and you're like, oh, that's a Russian. That's a Russian pretending to be an American. And this if you are involved in social media at all, this is a big thing you have to think about now, is what supposedly MAGA accounts are actually posting from India or Pakistan or Russia or wherever. You can get paid on X now. So, in countries where $500 a month is a big deal, they'll all just go create MAGA accounts. But so normally I think about this on social media, but somebody did this same kind of linguistic analysis of like weird phrases that make sense in Russian, but when you translate them to English, they just sound odd. Apparently several phrases like that were in the peace plan that was supposedly like a fully American idea. And yeah, it's just like, how do these very strange, Russian inflected phrases end up in the peace plan if it was Marco Rubio's idea?
Yeah. I didn't see that analysis, but I mean, to me, the Nazi line just screamed it. I mean, there are no, Timothy Snyder, the leading historian of Ukrainian history, has testified in front of Congress. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. The right-wing parties, the far-right parties, don't even pass the 5% threshold to get into parliament. There is no major right-wing presence here. And it's a crazy idea, denazification in Ukraine. But anyway, so next step in the story, after the world said this is unacceptable, Marco Rubio kind of stepped in and tried to sort of save the day by taking out some of that Russian stuff. We don't know exactly what he took out and what he left in because nobody has seen the resulting 19-point plan. But as soon as they started to modify it, Moscow said no thanks, as they predictably would. But, Putin has consistently stuck to what I consider the kind of Soviet style of negotiating, where you state your position, and that's your position. And no matter what happens in the talks, you don't change your position. And the other side thinks they've made some progress on I've been in negotiations like this, not with the Soviet Union, but with, I won't say who. You think you've made some progress on Tuesday, and you come back on Wednesday and say, okay, now we're starting over where we got to yesterday, right? And they say, no, 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 no. Where our plan hasn't changed, our view hasn't changed. He wants, he understands that the U.S. isn't going to give him, right away, the complete subjugation of Ukraine. What they're going to give him is subjugation of enough that when he feels ready in a couple of years, he can gobble up the rest. And in the meantime, he can undermine the rest by influencing the politics and the economy. And he understands that the U.S. isn't going to give him right away. NATO is broken, and you can have Poland and Estonia too. But by putting into the agreement that NATO will not expand any further, that's what Putin's fighting for. Is NATO? He wants NATO to roll back, which is setting the stage for. So Ukraine is defenseless. I mean, think about the consequences. Ukraine has been defending Europe all this time. When Ukraine stops fighting, Russia's got this amazing war machine now, and they don't want to stop fighting. They got more than 1 million men in arms. They don't want them to come home and be tearing up cities. They want to send all those million men to the borders of NATO. So right now, Ukraine is defending NATO. The war ends in a Trump-brokered ceasefire, and Russia suddenly turns his eyes on Eastern Europe.
I think it's important to remember what Russia originally wanted when they. Let's skip past 2014. In a longer podcast, we could talk even about that. But in 2022, when they launched the major invasion of Ukraine, they envisioned it as a decapitation strike,
Right.
moving, in eastern Ukraine, but especially also coming
Kyiv,
down into Kiev, which is much
yeah,
more centrally located.
where the capital is.
They wanted to be in Kiev within like 48 to 72 hours. They wanted to depose the national government and essentially install a puppet state. And the ultimate goal, if not outright annexation, is to have a Ukrainian puppet state that is only answerable to the Russian government. And do you think that is still ultimately the Russian goal?
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely still the goal. Look at Georgia. Georgia exists as a country, but Georgia is now wholly owned subsidiary of Russia. What Russia likes to call these countries is neutral. That means no Western influence, no Western help, no democracy, no market economy, and we can, steal from them as we please. We can tell them what to do and steal from them as they please. And that's what they want here. They want a quote unquote neutral state, which means no state at all. It means part of their, controlled family. And Ukraine doesn't want that. And, when you look at the polling, before 2014, like 90% of Ukrainians thought well of Russia. I mean, they did think of them as a big brother. Now, 90% plus of Ukrainians think Russia is, evil. And it's just literally the big, Z in the graph. The Ukrainians don't want to be a neutral state prey to Russia.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tragedy of all of this is that, for all of Putin's talk about Ukrainians don't exist and Ukrainians are just Russians with accents, historically, obviously, there are deep, deep links between the idea of Russia and the idea of Kievan Rus. And I'm not to make the claim that they're the same.
Yeah, no, the Ukrainian culture is very different. The Asian conquerors way back in the pre-Middle Ages stayed in Russia a lot longer. And so the idea of a kind of authoritarian state, top-down authoritarian state, took root there in a way that it never took root here. Ukrainians are democratically minded, anti-authority. It's a very different place. They may not have, Russia had better literature in the 19th century and better composers, and Ukraine was always a very poor place, but it is not Russian.
Yeah.
That's really a mistake.
All of this just to say that, if we lived in a better world, they would be like cousins that were much friendlier and had greater, cultural exchange
Yeah.
and lived next to each other in peace and harmony. And
we don't live in that world.
And we don't, but that I think that's the great shame of it is, like you said, there's there's no reason for Ukrainians to hate Russians. There are many things in common.
Well, the reason is 300 years of oppression, right? The
Yeah,
reason is
yeah.
300 years of oppression since Catherine the Great.
Just that.
Yeah. Um, I mean, what Trump doesn't understand, imagine that the American Revolution could have been settled by a little land swap in Delaware, right? Like that's how false this is. Ukraine wants to be a country. They don't want to give up a little bit of Delaware or anything else. They don't want to be part of Russia. That's what this war is really about. And that's why Ukraine hasn't lost yet, because they have a stronger sense of nationhood. They're building up a defense industry to defend themselves. They're fighting on despite all odds. And so, it's tough. I mean, let's be clear. They're small and Russia's big. And you were onto something when you said Russia has more men and Russia has a big industrial machine. Ukraine has a good, very innovative, important defense industry, but it's not the Russian industrial machine. But they're determined to fight. They would say, and I think they're onto something, they're more innovative and more determined. And so the war could go on for a long time. I mean, I don't think, Zelensky, the way Zelensky posed it after the 28-point plan was put on the table, he said, we're facing a really tough choice here. And the choice, he used the word dignity, but really the choice is, do we go on fighting as a country or do we give in now and go with America? And he didn't say how they would decide, but my prediction would be they will just, if it comes to that, they will decide to go on fighting. And it'll get tougher and tougher, if America withdraws, stops selling the weapons to Europe, and if America withdraws the intelligence support, it'll be a lot harder for Ukraine. A lot more people will die. And it'll be more dangerous for me sitting here in Kyiv. It's because of American intelligence that they know what missiles are coming when. And so, we'll get a lot tougher. But I think Ukraine will fight to the last man.
So here's a question about these deals. In the broad level, you seem obviously very skeptical that there's going to be any sort of meaningful deal, that it's at all possible for Ukraine and Russia to agree on some set of principles, because, as you said, it seems like just opposing at the very core of what they want. But do you think? Let me pose the question this way. Do you think there's even a 5% chance, a 10% chance of a deal in the next year? Or is even that would be too optimistic?
Well, I mean, who knows? A year is a long time in a war, right? So, and I mean, Ukrainians do want to stop fighting, and Ukrainians are willing to say that territory. So Russia now holds roughly 20%, 19 point something, 18 point something percent of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is willing to say that territory that you're standing on, Russian troops, you're standing on for now. There's nothing we can do about that. They're willing to say that. They don't want to say that, and it's still contested among Ukrainians, but I think they would say that. They're not prepared to say you own it permanently. They're prepared to. So it's the difference between de facto and de jure, right?
Yeah.
So they're willing to say, okay, you're standing there now. There's not much we could do. The same way the Germans couldn't say, you're standing in East Germany. We need it back. They said we're going to wait, and so Ukraine's prepared to do that. And I think Ukraine is probably even prepared to forego NATO for some amount of time, forego membership in NATO, since the membership in NATO isn't really on the table anyway because of U.S. veto. But they're not willing to give back land that Russia hasn't won yet. I mean, that's what Russia's asking for, a chunk of territory the size of Delaware that would make it much easier for Russia to take the rest of Ukraine that they've been trying to win for 12 years and haven't succeeded in winning. They want Trump to give it to them at the negotiating table.
And just so people know, we're talking about the some of the territories involved. Like Russia controls basically all of Luhansk region. Right. They control most of Donetsk at this point.
It's about 70. It's not most. Well, it's most, but it's not all. It's this, again. But Delaware is not a huge state, but it's, that gives Americans a sense of how big it is. It's a big territory, and it's the high ground, and it's blood-soaked. They've been fighting over it now for 14 years. And Ukraine is not just going to say you can have that because Trump said so.
Yeah, and there's, I would say like Donetsk and Kherson, and I don't know how to pronounce this, but Zaporizhzhia.
Zaporizhzhia.
Yeah, and those are territories where Russia controls the majority of those, but Ukraine still holds on to a significant portion of them. Russia wants all of it. Ukraine is not going to back down from.
Yeah, they're not really claiming all of they're not claiming all of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. They're claiming all of Donetsk, and
Okay,
that's what Ukraine won't give up.
yeah,
But the point here, the paragraph here, the point is that Ukraine is willing to make some compromises in the short term, right? They do want peace very badly, and they're playing along to some degree with Trump. You know, they're willing to consider compromises. They're not willing to consider their existence, and they're not willing to consider giving territory back, and they're not willing to consider a situation where Russia will just be able to roll over them again in a year or two. So you know, could it if Putin was to soften up a little, there could be the possibility of peace. If Putin was actually willing to accept the reality of the moment and sort of go from there instead of claiming stuff he hasn't won, and if Putin was willing to accept, you know, the war's come this far, this is where it is, now what do we do? Then there would be a possibility of peace, but he's not. So, you know, when is he gonna change his mind? I can't predict that.
and that is part of the really troubling part of this war, and trying to really understand what's happening here, is that so much of it depends on two men who are extremely hard to predict, extremely hard to model and understand. One of them is obviously Vladimir Putin. The other one is Donald Trump,
Well,
who, you know, can vary wildly back and forth on, maybe just depending on the last person he's talked to,
right.
whether or not he's pro Russia, pro
Well,
Ukraine. You know, just
fundamentally, he's more pro-Russia. He thinks Russia is a great power and a great country and a historic great country, the peer of the US. And he thinks Ukraine is kind of like Delaware. I mean, Ukraine's a lot bigger than Delaware, but he thinks it's, you know, Florida, a country that he doesn't really is not a great country, not a great power, not a historical great power, not his peer. And he's been way too credulous. And who knows what other holds Putin has over him. You know, there's been a lot of speculation. I don't know. In a way, I don't care. But so Trump's instinct is to think Russia's winning, that Ukraine has no cards. You know, of course, the great power is winning. Of course, the great power will triumph eventually. Let's just get it over with faster. And we can do it. This is Trump thinking, and we can do it by divvying up a little bit of territory. Well, that's really misreading the situation.
yeah. I just I agree that you know, Trump is probably more Russia friendly than any American president has been in generations. I don't even know how far you'd have to go back, pre World War II maybe, but it does seem to me like there's some sort of chess games, mental games that are played sometimes about, like, well, let's position ourselves so that we're the ones agreeing with Trump and make the other guy be the one who
Well,
breaks the
sure,
deal. You know,
sure.
that Ukraine, like, some of the headlines that I'm seeing are like, Ukraine has agreed to a modified deal. You know, and obviously they didn't agree to the 28-point plan. They agreed to some newer version of it. But it's almost like, if we can put Russia in the position of they're the ones who rejected the plan, maybe that gives us a better shot to, like, keep friendly terms with the Americans. Maybe we'll get some more weapons, you know, and this has happened before, where Trump has just thought he had something, and then, you know, somebody pisses him off, and so he just reacts in the other direction and says, well, now we're going to give some weapons, or
Yeah.
something like that. And it's just so hard to predict what might come of that.
It's a kabuki play on both sides. So that what everybody wants to do is avoid being in the Trump penalty box. And if you look like you're the country that wants peace, you're not in the penalty box. The other guy is the one that's being stubborn and saying no. And so what's proposed matters a lot, because if what's proposed is totally pro-Russian, Russia can say, we want it, we want it. Of course, Ukraine has to object to it. If the plan is totally Ukraine focused, which none of them have been, of course, Russia's going to say no. So there is a game going on there about penalty box, but it's not morally equivalent. You know, the point is, Ukraine does really want peace, and Ukraine would make some sacrifices for peace. Putin is not willing to make any sacrifices for peace or any concessions.
And I mean, the things that Putin is willing to sacrifice are just, you know, they're not sacrifices to him. He doesn't care in any practical sense how many young Russian men are sacrificed to the meat grinder. But Is it a sacrifice if he tosses another million dead Russians at Ukraine?
Not particularly. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. And I mean, sure, there were a couple things. Well, like, so supposedly the 19-point plan compared to the 28-point plan, we're talking the size of the Russian army, the Ukrainian army. So Russia wants to limit the size of the Ukrainian army. And even the 28-point plan wasn't as dramatic as Putin's been asking for on the size of the Ukrainian army. And the 19-point plan was even a little better for Ukraine. And so the army is still a sizable army. They still have to get rid of a lot of the men in the army, but it's still sizable. So that looks like Putin's giving something, but he's not really, because he's going to get the high ground, and he's going to get Europe standing back, and he's going to get no European troops in Ukraine, and he's going to get no NATO for Ukraine. So even if it's 800,000 men in the Ukrainian army or 850,000 men in the Ukrainian army, isn't going to make that much difference when Putin decides to swoop again.
Yeah, and that's one of the big factors here is, can you even trust Putin? If there was to be a deal, could you even trust the Russians to uphold it? Or in 5 years when they judge it advantageous,
1 or 2 years. He's not, I doubt he's waiting 5. No, Putin, I don't think Putin has kept to any treaty that he signed since he was leader of Russia. And nobody thinks he will keep to this. And there's the language in the 28 points is laughable. It says Russia will pass a law stating non-aggression toward Ukraine and Europe. I mean, that will not be worth the paper it's printed on. And there's a line that says it is expected that Russia will abide by this agreement. I mean, it's all just, it's like, you would laugh if you weren't crying.
it is expected that when mom leaves the cookies out, I don't put my hand in the cookie jar.
Well,
But
indeed.
we've all seen where that leads. So I want to ask kind of a forward-looking question, and obviously none of us have a crystal ball, but let's assume like that no peace deal actually gets made here. That there's a big round of showy nonsense talks, and then nothing really happens. What's your expectation? And I'll ask it this way: what's your optimistic expectation of like what could the next year look like for Ukraine if things go their way, if they get enough material support from Europe, if the US doesn't back off too strongly? What in your view would be kind of how the next year could play out,
Yeah.
with an optimistic tint? We
Yeah,
can also
yeah.
tackle in a pessimistic tint later if we want.
It's more fighting, it's more dead soldiers, it's more, electricity destroyed. It's not good. But the point is, if they're still standing in a year, that's a form of prevailing. And so it's about, they're defending against an aggressor. And so the question is, can they keep up that defense? The best thing that could happen is that they build up their own defense capabilities even further. And again, they need, the best thing that happens is the country keeps the lights on, literally, like the country keeps paying the teacher salaries and the men keep fighting at the front. And the Russians don't take, more than a little bit of dirt here and there, if that. And that Ukraine builds up its defense industry and increases its ability to hit deep into Russia. And that the world, it all goes beyond Ukraine, that the world continues to choke the Russian economy. I mean, the sanctions are a huge, important part of this. And the U.S., passed some draconian sounding sanctions. Trump imposed some draconian sounding sanctions a couple of months ago, but he has to enforce them. Now, will he enforce them? Very dubious. But the idea. I mean, what's going to stop Putin is when he calculates that he can't win, that all this death and all this cost and all this whatever is for nothing. And he won't decide that until his economy is really in trouble and until he sees that the West is standing firm. And that's where Trump's real damage is because that he's trumpeting to Putin, the West isn't standing firm. I'm mercurial, and I'm the Europeans to some degree are going to have to follow me, and you can't count on anything. So
Yeah.
that is the problem. So it's a tough year ahead. There's not a big light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, even the optimistic version doesn't seem very optimistic, but it almost reminds me like you've seen Rocky,
Yeah, of
the movie?
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, it's in Rocky, his great victory in the original movie is just that he doesn't get knocked out.
Right,
He
right,
goes
right,
12 rounds
right.
with the champ, and it's a close decision, and he ends up losing, but he stays on his feet,
That's
he
it,
doesn't get
that's
knocked
it.
out, and that kinda seems like the situation Ukraine is in. They're gonna keep taking body blows over and over, they're gonna keep taking them. The electricity is gonna keep getting interrupted, there's gonna be death, but as long as they can stand their ground, then that's the victory, is they still exist.
That's the victory for them. Exactly. And, but the other important thing to come back to is really is Europe, right? Because the war really is spilling over into Europe in a much more aggressive, violent, dangerous way. I mean, they almost last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, a whole big Polish train full of people almost got blown up, right? Thank goodness an engineer saw the trouble on the tracks ahead and stopped the train. But again, it's you know, some of it's just menace, drones and planes flying over, but some of it's actually dangerous. If I mean, it didn't succeed, but remember last year they tried, or maybe a year and a half ago, Russia was going to put explosive devices on DHL planes, or what's the FedEx planes, and what if a plane like that? What if they put an explosive device in a FedEx package on a passenger jet, and a big American jet had exploded over the Atlantic? I mean, and Russia's getting more and more reckless about that. And so, what's the year ahead going to bring on that front? Big question. And it's very hard for Europe to fight back against that, right? Because we're not going to
Yeah.
blow up planes and coming over from Russia. We're not going to bomb hospitals or have arson and fire in shopping centers, and we're not going to try to assassinate Russian CEOs.
Is it bad that I my first thought is, "Man, it would have been really good if Russia blew up a FedEx plane." Because look, not a passenger plane, like, let's
There,
let's minimize the death, but that would essentially assure US support for Ukraine. Like, if Russia had been caught doing that, then all of a sudden it's permanent, and, I wish they were stupid enough to have done that, to have gone through with it.
yeah. Well, it wasn't that they hesitated, it was that they got caught, that somebody found the damn devices.
Yeah.
Um, so no, there's no good ahead, but the drama for me that I'm watching is, does Europe get it together?
Yeah.
Because they're so important for Ukraine. Ukraine's so important for them, but because it really is defending them. But they're so important for Ukraine. And as America pulls back from Europe and the world turns into a US, China, Russia great power thing, Europe really has to step up to the plate and kind of grow up into a world power. And they're trying their hardest to do that, but they got a lot of obstacles. So to me, that's going to be the drama of the next year. Stuff is going to happen in Ukraine, and it's going to be important, and it's going to be, a tough year. But the drama of the year to come for me is about Europe.
With the US no longer taking that kind of active role that it may have had in the past, how optimistic are you about Europe stepping up on a scale of 1 to 10? Like, ten being the dream scenario, 1 being the nightmare.
Somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the middle. It's like watching a sports team it's like watching the Chicago Cubs or something. It's like watching a sports team, that you wanted to win all these years, and how do they do?
Hey, the
Um,
Cubbies did end up winning a World Series a few years back,
They
they
did, they
finally did
did.
it,
They
so
finally did it, yeah. But, Europe is really trying. I mean, they're not gonna have mandatory draft now, but both Germany and France just in the last few weeks decided they're gonna bring men into the armed forces. They're gonna try to have volunteer armed forces, grow them, and they're all spending a ton more than they were spending on defense a couple of years ago. Money's not enough, and even soldiers aren't enough. They have to come together and do things together. And that's a big challenge for them because, there's, you know, 3 dozen different countries. Some of them are belong to this group and some of them belong to that group, but it's hard to get them to agree, even the ones in the, even the EU and the NATO that are in these alliances. So the cohesion and leadership are really the big questions. Can they do some things collectively? Instead of making, 7 different kinds of main battle tanks, can they make one and make a lot of them? But that requires a lot of cooperation that they're having trouble. They want to do, but they're just having trouble doing. So again, it's like watching a sports team that you really want to win, but you're not so sure.
I'll close with the traditional final question that I ask on this podcast, which is, where can people go if they want to learn more? If they want to learn more about the war, if they want to learn more about how the Ukrainian people are living, how they're thinking, what the conditions on the ground are, all the things we've been talking about, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more?
Well, there are lots of sources and lots of sites. All my work is posted on the PPI, Progressive Policy Institute site. A lot of places cover the war well. A lot of other media outlets cover the war well. That FT does a very particularly good job. The Brits do a good job. The Economist does a good job. Radio Free Europe still struggles along, and they do a good job. It's a lot of people. The people. I mean, Europe is paying more attention than America for all the reasons we've talked about.
Well, I want to thank you for the work you're doing over there. You've been living there for several years now, and it seems like there's not anywhere in the world where the struggle of liberalism against authoritarianism is as clear as it is in Ukraine. That this is a country that, if we're being honest, for decades had struggled with a corrupt and at least semi-authoritarian kind of system, and the people got sick of it, and the people wanted liberalism. The people wanted democracy. They wanted to be a modern European nation with all the trappings of liberal democracy and the things that come with that, rule of law, equal rights, and they were punished for that Russia does not want them to be a liberal democracy. Russia wants them to be a client state autocracy. And there's nowhere in the world that it's just as abundantly clear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, where, they're fighting for the liberal democratic rights that so many of us have taken for granted for, generations. And so I hope they win is my closing message here, I guess. But for people who are listening, just really consider all the times that we talk about democracy and all the times we talk about liberalism here in so many different contexts. This is where the struggle is being fought in its purest form, I think.
No, nicely put. Absolutely right. And it's a struggle that has to happen on the battlefield. And then it's also a struggle that has to happen inside Ukraine, because they're not yet the country they want to be. And that's work that's being done now. And I mean, I don't know if you saw the news today, the anti-corruption agency here raided the home of the president's number one aide, the guy who really runs the country. And so it's that much of a democracy that imagine if the FBI went to J.D. Vance's house and it wasn't like driven by the opponents, it was driven by the country trying to be democratic.
And I think this is, a bad news, good news kind of thing, because number one, Ukraine is not done. Like, they are still far more corrupt than they should be.
They are,
but they're trying. The people want this.
Look at that! Look at that! In the middle of the war, the civil society was strong enough that this agency could go and I mean, who knows what's going to come of it? And that guy's very powerful, Andrei Yermak. But it's a country. It is certainly a country fighting for democracy, for a free market economy, to join the West, for all the things that we call liberalism with a capital L.
Well, thank you for the work you do one more time, Tamar. Thank you for being on the show, and
thank you for the opportunity.
Glory to Ukraine, I guess.
Glory to Ukraine. Thanks for the opportunity.